Addicted to suffering, can that really be a thing? It actually can, and we're going to talk about being addicted to suffering and how we actually are benefiting. So go ahead and subscribe to this podcast, give us a 5-star review, and you can also find us on YouTube. You can find us on Instagram with Live Brighter with Tara. I'd love to engage with you more, and welcome to this week's podcast. So addicted to suffering, is that really a thing? And it really is, and it's pretty wild to think about. The reason we can get addicted to our own suffering is because there is a secondary gain. There is a gain, or our brain thinks that there's a gain, and so we can get in a pattern of suffering and just be addicted to that. So let's talk about that. First of all, patterns of suffering, what am I talking about? Basically, they're patterns of strong emotions that are repetitive and that get perpetuate. And basically, it leaves us stuck. And so what we're supposed to be doing with strong emotions, what we talk about a lot in this podcast, is we're supposed to feel our emotions and deal with them and work through them. Resisting them doesn't work. Reacting not very helpful because we end up ruining relationships and all sorts of things, but processing. But what happens is we can get in a pattern of strong emotions and they just become our regular feelings that we have. Some of these patterns can look like a feeling of fear all the time. And there can be an addiction to that. And we'll talk about the secondary gain in a moment. Another one is doubt. We can feel doubt just about ourselves, about our ability, and that can be an addiction and cause us suffering. We can have a habit of worry, and that's, again, we can be addicted to the worry and the secondary gain of that. There's also disappointment, resentment, confusion, unhappiness. If we're feeling any of those regularly, then there's something going on, and we can have an addiction to it, get in the habit of it, and basically doing that is a dream killer. It's toxic, and it's really good to be aware of that. So first of all, we have to understand the secondary gain. So what that means is our mind basically thinks it's benefiting in some way, and it does this by keeping us small and constricted. So let's talk about it. Fear. And this is one I can relate to. I feel like I had this fear of the world ever since I was a kid. And it was kind of like this message: the world is a scary place. Be afraid. The world is a scary place. So there was definitely a fear of the world. And that definitely kept me from playing big and from taking risks and doing things. But that fear kind of kept me cozy and safe at times. But it was addicted. I was addicted to the suffering and to the emotion of fear. Another one example is comparing to others. I feel like in our culture with social media, it's very easy to get in the habit of comparing ourselves to others, but it actually can become suffering for us. Constantly comparing ourselves to others and not measuring up is suffering, and it can be addictive because there is the gain of, if I'm comparing myself to others and I find myself always less, I don't have to play big. I don't have to take risks. I can stay small, and our brains and our minds think, oh, that's wonderful, we're safe. Staying small is good, but it can hurt us in the long run. Again, it can be a dream killer. It can keep us from being the best version of ourselves. So comparing ourselves to others, super easy to get in this culture and can be addictive and cause suffering. Another one, resentment. Ooh, this is a good one. I was actually talking to my husband this morning about resentment. And resentment, I feel like, is a sister to bitterness. But resentment is kind of interesting because it basically blames others. So you see blame or you see boundaries crossed, but it's almost a progressive of allowing this, and it creates this feeling of resentment or bitterness. And I don't know if you guys have known people, but I know people that are just resentful and bitter. And there is a secondary gain for that. Because if you're resentful, then it's other people's faults and you're the victim. And you can, again, stay small, not take responsibility. And again, our mind thinks that that's great. But again, it can hurt us. It can hurt our peace. It can hurt us living brightly and abundantly. And it can, again, be addictive to resentment. I like Mike and I were reading this morning, because it was talking about how resentment should be like a warning light on our car, that if we're feeling that, then it's making us alert. And I feel like all of these should be that, because all of these can be like, hey, there's something up. There's something up. If we're regularly having overwhelm, fear, resentment, unhappiness, if we're overwhelmingly having these, then there's probably some sort of addiction to the suffering, and it's something to explore. Another, like with resentment, that's an interesting thing that I've been seeing in lives around me recently. I have a family member that's very resentful against another family member. And as I see him complaining about this family member, what I'm seeing is that it's keeping him from having to take ownership of some things in his life. And it makes himself the victim and also the saint all at the same time. Or have you guys ever known somebody that's very resentful for an ex-husband or someone like that? It can be very easy to feel that resentment and from like somebody we feel betrayed about. But what it does is it keeps them from not progressing in their own life, and it keeps them stuck. And again, our minds thinks that's a great idea to be stuck and small, but really we're not made for that. We're made to live an abundant life. We're made to grow. We're not made to live in suffering state all the time when we're adding it to ourselves. There is suffering in the world. Why are we manifesting it more? So, have you gone through a breakup that's kind of left you rattled and maybe questioning yourself some? Do you find that you're a pretty kind person that's chronically overgiving, overfunctioning, and maybe you're just plain tired and maybe a little resentful? Do you feel like you're going through the motions of life, but you're not really living your life? Well, that's what the Unravel Notebook is for. It's 61 days for you to create your life by intent and unravel your thoughts and beliefs so you can connect with God, yourself, and others in a better, more intentional way and live brighter. Another one, like I can relate to this one, addicted to unhappiness. So it's kind of interesting. In my previous marriage, I was unhappy with that relationship because it was very destructive and abusive. And somehow I had gotten kind of in that pattern of an addiction to it, in the sense that I was sacrificing myself for the family and sacrificing myself to God, and somehow that made me worthy. But the truth is I was allowing that, and I was addicted to it, and it kind of kept my eyes off from the reality of the situation, from really looking at it. So the story was basically addicted to suffering. Another common one is worry. Worry is interesting because it feels like we're doing something constructively, but we're actually not engaging in anything constructive, and not engaging, and it's taking away energy from our own lives. So it's interesting. I've heard of worry as like kind of a rocking chair where it's just going back and forth, but not really going anywhere. And that's how worry is. I like the idea, and I'm trying to think of where I've heard this quote, but it basically is: a wise man dies once and a foolish man dies multiple of times. And it's basically, a foolish man is projecting and worrying and thinking about all the options of death, whereas a wise man just dies. And so he's not worrying about it and not fixating on it. Or like worry is something that's very interesting when it talks about like, as kids, when we have kids, I think it's easy as moms to get in the habit of worry for our kids. But really what it does is it keeps us expending energy, not constructively, and it keeps us from expending energy in our own lives, and keeps our focus on our kids when, that's not helping them and it's not serving us. But it's very addictive, because the secondary gain is we feel like we're doing something, quote unquote, but we're not doing anything. And we can get in a pattern and it keeps us small. All of these keep us small. Anger, very addictive. Blaming others so we don't have to take control of our own life is very interesting to watch that in ourselves. And I, just the other day, I'm like, wow, I'm kind of getting in a pattern of anger. And so I actually had to go through this, the things that I'm telling you, to figure out, okay, what is the secondary gain for my anger? How am I benefiting from this? And then, just kind of doing what I'm going to talk to you guys about. So we'll go through that. Another one I can really relate to is confusion. Confusion really just leads to paralysis. But our brains, again, are thinking, yay, confusion, that'll keep us small. We'll just have to not do as much because it feels safe this way. But it doesn't help us in the long run, and it can be an addictive pattern. So it's really interesting as I was going through this podcast. It's like I can relate to all of them at some time in my life and what I'm dealing with now. So I would say the one that I'm dealing with now is overwhelm. And that's something with my work that I can see sometimes I'll get overwhelmed, and then that'll keep me from doing what I need to do. And it can be a pattern. And so I'm noticing that in my own life, and that's why I use this information and this process to help me. So all of those addictions to suffering, which is shocking that we can actually get a secondary gain from all of those things, keep us as a victim and keep us from living our intentional best lives, keep us from living our free life, and keep our light from shining. So the first thing we need to do is just pause, name it, feel it, explore the secondary gain. The next one is we need to realize that our thoughts are optional. We can get in a process of these stories that create the same thoughts, that create the same feelings, but our thoughts are optional. And let's review this. I think a lot of times we say, oh, we're angry. Like I could say, I'm angry because Mike did this or something like that. But, it's important to feel the feelings. But if I keep in a pattern of that, and then it gets stuck. And so basically, it's so important to remember that the things that happen to us, the facts, are in the C line. There's the circumstance. And our thoughts about those facts, our thoughts are optional and they're a choice. And our thoughts are what creates our feelings. And so when we get into this process of feeling these regular patterns, it's because we're repeating these same thoughts and these same stories automatically. And so the most important thing is to do a thought download and just barf them out. Barf out all the thoughts. Like, I am angry about my husband. So I'm going to just write all the things I'm angry about, and I'm going to just barf them all out. And then we get to sort them out. We get to decide, we get to choose, like, okay, why am I feeling this way? What do I need to do? How do I need to look at this differently? How do I, we get to dissect that a little bit and decide on what thought we want to have. Like, do we want to have this anger, or do we want to have a different thought? Do we want to create some actions? All of those things. So we always have to remember that our feelings are not based off the circumstances, what somebody did to us. It's because there's a thought in between about the circumstances. And that is what creates our feelings, not the circumstance. And that's huge. So our thoughts are optional. Our thoughts we get to choose. And our thoughts are worth exploring. So that's number 2. So again, feel it, name it, feel it. 2, remember our thoughts are optional. Do a thought download. And number 3, we can get some support on the intentional life. Because, we can do the practice of barf it out, sort it out, plan it out. And I have that in my website that you can get free, that process, and super helpful. And sometimes it's difficult for us to see how our mind is working. And so if you ever get a life coach from the Life Coach School, and that's one of my certifications, it's super helpful because basically what we're doing is showing you your own brain and letting you decide intentionally how you want to live, what you want to do. And so getting support, whether it be from a friend who can kind of see more of the situation, or from a counselor, or from a life coach, or whatever we need to do, we can disrupt these patterns of suffering, and we can go beyond that. So has there been a strong emotion that you've been feeling regularly, that you're seeing this repetitive pattern? I definitely have. And so I encourage you, like me, to do our thought downloads, to pause, name it, feel it. Remember, our thoughts are optional, and get the support we need to live the intentional life. So live brighter every day. Grow 1% a day. I believe in you. Make it a great day.